So invasive weeds, what are they? Invasive weeds, and this is a very, very good definition of what invasive weed is. They're species introduced outside their natural range whose presence threatens not only our biological biodiversity, but also the environment, environmental services, recreational exploitation, the economy and human health. So that's a fair statement. The effect the presence threatens biological diversity, our environment, environmental services, recreational exploitation and human health. So they're a serious threat and a serious challenge for you as communities and for us as local authorities in all arms of the state. This slide shows the four most invasive species that we have to deal with in the country. And the first is Japanese knotweed, and the map just underneath it here gives an indication of its spread throughout the country. And you can see it's widely spread throughout the country, and it's a huge challenge to deal with. And I'm going to go into that in more detail in a minute. The second slide shows a species called giant hogweed, and that is, you can see the map underneath gives an indication how widely spread around the country giant hogweed is. The third is a weed called Himalayan balsam, and it's also a huge challenge. And the fourth is one that's very prominent here in Mayo, is a thing called wild rhubarb, otherwise known as gunrag. A huge mistake that communities often make is, what is an invasive weed? And it's often mixed up with noxious weed. They're a completely different, distinct group of plants. Noxious weeds, and anybody that has an agricultural background will note, one of the most sort of common noxious weeds is ragwort, or bowlawns as we call it around here. But they're a very distinct, separate group of plants. Invasive weeds are completely different, so don't mix them up. They're a completely distinct and separate group of plants. I want to now focus on Japanese knotweed. And this slide shows the spread of Japanese knotweed. This is where we were in the 1940s, very little, maybe 2 or 3 populations of it in the country, and you can see it's beginning to get, as we move on to the 1980s, you can see it's beginning to get a hold in Ireland and the UK. And this is where we are in 2016. So it has gone from this to this in a very short period of time. And this is a significant statement that we see on the right-hand corner here. Today, Japanese knotweed is listed among the worst invasive species in the world by the Global Invasive Species Programme. So that's a very, very significant statement. It's listed as among the worst invasive species in the world. And it's one of Ireland's most unwanted species, and the spread at which it has, at the speed at which it's spread throughout the country, is deemed nothing but extraordinary. What is Japanese knotweed? It's a herbaceous perennial. So what is a herbaceous perennial? It comes out of the ground in April, May, and it dies back in September, October. So we see it for six months of the year, and for 6 months of the year we just simply don't see it. The problem with it is that it grows everywhere. Most plants have a specific environment they like to grow in, a specific soil type, like an acid soil or an alkaline soil. They're like a free draining soil, export or a shelter. But what? The thing about Japanese knotweed, it literally can grow anywhere. And that's why it is so successful. And that's why it's such a challenge. Japanese knotweed is described as a non-native invasive plant, and it's come, as I mentioned previously, it comes from Japan and northern China. Its natural habitat is the volcanic slopes of Japan's mountain ranges, and it was introduced by Victorians to Ireland in the mid-19th century as an ornamental plant. And believe it or not, it was a gold medal winner in the Chelsea Flower Show in the early part of the 19th century. And believe it or not, the judges said it at the time that it was a plant of the future, and they certainly got that right. So the spread of Japanese knotweed, really, how was it getting out? How was it got about? Well, it's through purposeful planting. So a lot of people would have taken it in their gardens and bought it, and in fact it could be bought through garden centres right into the 1980s. And when they trimmed it and when they moved it, it basically escaped from the gardens, and that escaped and went undetected for years, and that's how it's got such a hold. It's very common, widely distributed across a variety of habitats in Ireland. So where is it? It's everywhere. Most prominent on roadsides, waste ground, riverbanks, near railway lines, and in wetland habitats. So it's basically everywhere. It is now well established as a major management concern for public authorities. No mistake about it, a major management concern for all public authorities. Japanese knotweed along rivers. Rivers are particularly vulnerable to Japanese knotweed habitats of both fish and animals are destroyed as it encroaches on our riverbanks. Rivers, by their nature, constantly spread the weed downriver, over land and out to sea. And I have specific concern about recent flooding events in 2015 and 2016, particularly on rivers that I'm very familiar with, the North Mayo, the River Moyle and the River Dee. And there's ample evidence that contaminated soil has been washed down the rivers as a result of these flooding incidents, and new infestations or juvenile infestations of Japanese knotweed are appearing. So it is a huge concern for those that are involved in our rivers. The inland fisheries and the OPW and all these different organisations that are charged with the responsibility of the rivers. It is certainly a concern that's going to have to be addressed in the rest of the Japanese knotweed in construction. Japanese knotweed, it can grow up to 10 centimetres a day. Unbelievable. It causes damage to structures and substructures by targeting the weak points, such as cracks, and attempting to grow through them. Typical damage from Japanese knotweed includes damage to tarmac, paving areas, building foundations, retaining walls, structures and drains. And on brownfield sites that's for development, where you can't treat it using sprays and chemicals, it's a very costly plant in terms of development. And eradication before construction can be very, very high. We had a site here in Westport up in Tugger Hill where it cost us almost 80,000 to remove it prior to development. Construction during the Celtic years in Ireland contributed greatly to the spread of Japanese knotweed. And Japanese knotweed thrives on disturbance. Where you find it, you don't touch it, you don't move it, or you don't interfere with it in any way. Mark it and map it. Because as soon as you begin to touch it or interfere with it or disturb it anyway, that's what it likes. It thrives on disturbance. Contaminated soil was routinely distributed and transported during these years for construction and road building, and that's how it was spread. In more recession years, ghost estates where contaminated soil is present, it tends to be more of a problem there. We don't have a huge amount of ghost estates in County Mayo, so it's not really a problem in Mayo, but it is in ghost estates a problem in near the bigger cities. And it's a well-known fact that 70 million, it cost the UK exchequer 70 million to clear the Olympic Park for the London Olympics in 2012. And it's important to know that as the years go by, Japanese knotweed is growing and spreading in even wider circles, increasing the cost to the environment and the economy. And this is this type of thing that is typically the way it will grow. And in around buildings like this, it can affect the structures. It has this ability to get into foundations. And where it finds any weakness, any crack in the structure of a foundation of a building, it just manages to get in there and weakens the structures. And that's why it's a huge concern in relation to building. But the biggest threat, make no mistake about it, for Japanese knotweed is on our biodiversity. The biodiversity is where the huge challenge is. It's important to remember that the greatest destruction that the knotweed family causes is to the biodiversity of this country. Invasive species are recognised as the greatest threat to biodiversity after humans. And we all have a responsibility to protect our environment, both for its sake and the sake of future generations. So biodiversity, make no mistake, that's where the challenge is. Biodiversity in Japanese knotweed is a problem for many reasons, as it's both an alien and invasive. It outcompetes our own native plants, which affects further up the food chain to our native insects and animals. It just outcompetes everything else. It outgrows everything else, and nothing else gets a chance. I deem it as extremely invasive. No other plants are tolerated, and it reduces the habitats for our small invertebrates. So we're talking about our foxes, our rabbits, our rodents. They get no chance because their habitat is destroyed. It just simply grows so thick that nothing else is tolerated. Japanese knotweed in the law, and you need to know this, is protected under the Birds and Natural Habitats Regulations 2011, and it makes an offence to plant, disperse, allow dispersal, or cause the spread of Japanese knotweed. Keep the plant in possession for the purpose of sale, breeding, or reproduction. Or keep anything from which the plant can be reproduced or propagated is also an offence. And keep any vector material, soil in this case, or spoil, taken from Japanese knotweed for the purpose of breeding, distribution, introduction, or release. And believe it or not, it's punishable by a fine of up to €500,000 and or imprisonment. management. It's the National Parks and Wildlife Service that are deemed with the responsibility for implementing the legislation. But it is significant. The fines are very significant, $500,000, and are 3 years imprisonment. Treatment methods for Japanese knotweed. Herbicide. You can see there the picture. It is extremely invasive. And this guy, poor devil down here, he's trying to stem inject it. A huge challenge to try and stem inject it. And you can, that just gives you an idea how extremely invasive it is. The methods that we normally use as a local authority is what we call herbicide spraying. And what we learned is, I mentioned earlier, Japanese knotweed, the way it grows. But when it emerges from the ground in April, May and June, it begins to flower July into August into September, and dies back September into October. But applying herbicide early in the season, when it's in its emergent state from the ground, April, May, all its vigor is going into getting out of the ground, so it's trying to get out of the ground. And we have been trying to spray it, thinking it was the right thing to do, to spray it early in the season. But at best, all we were doing was really knocking it back. All its vigor is into getting out of the ground, all its challenge is to get out of the ground in its emergent state. But we learned, if you hit it later in the year, and it's beginning to die back into the ground, the plant into its, what we call its herbaceous state, the plant has the ability to suck the chemical back in, the poison or the toxin, and it's far more effective treatment late in the season as it's gone back into its herbaceous state. Far more effective. So we learned that, but we learned it the hard way. Other methods is stem injection, and that's a physical injection of chemical that they put into the stem. We don't do a lot of it as a local authority, simply because it's expensive, and it's expensive because it's labour intensive. But it is another way, in my opinion, only acceptable to do when you get small populations in domestic back gardens. Another technique is a thing called weed wiping, also very effective, but also very labour intensive. And it's something that we've done on occasion. But as I said, herbicide spraying, you just cover a huge quantity of it at a relatively insignificant cost. Excavation followed by stockpiling and herbicide treatment is normally what's done on what we call development sites or brownfield sites. Extremely expensive way of doing it. The roots of Japanese knotweed extend 7 metres out from the mother plant and up to 3 metres deep. So when you start to dig, it's 7 metres, it's a substantial distance, and up to 3 metres deep. So where you've gone to development sites and you're trying to do this, it's a huge cost. And the biosecurity associated with it, in other words, decontaminating our machines, decontaminating our plants, the biosecurity measures on these brownfield sites are very significant, and so very significant cost. We also hear a lot about beneficial predators. In other words, is there something that kills it in its own environment, is there something that manages it? And there is an aphid that manages on the plains of Japan and China. And some testing has been done in the UK in protected environments like glasshouses to see does it work. It's not going to be the answer, because the risk associated with it is huge, in the sense that the cure might also be invasive. In other words, that we don't know if the aphid that's took in might himself become invasive. So there's a huge challenge with that. We also hear stuff about, is it edible, should you eat it? And this leads to a huge amount of frustration, because we put these signs up and we tell people not to touch it, not to cut it, not to move it, or interfere with it in any way at all. Because where you find it and you touch it or move it, it takes 0.7 of a gram of contaminated soil to form a new plant, minuscule. Basically what would be in the sole of your shoe, what you can carry in the sole of your shoe. So it's a huge challenge. So don't, the edible thing, I think, is people trying to make headlines for themselves. But certainly, my advice always is, don't touch it, don't cut it, don't move it or interfere with it in any way at all. The way forward. We found as local authorities that we've invested significant funding in partnership with the NRA for Transport Infrastructure Ireland. But what we've often found ourselves on approach roads to towns and villages, where we're spraying the land or the ditch or the ground that we own. And Japanese knotweed, with respect to it, doesn't know whether it's in private land or public land, it doesn't know where it goes. So often what we've found over the past is that getting consent to go in on private land is often difficult. So last year we developed two partnerships, partnership with the Greater Community Kilchamaugh and the Westport Town area. And what we did was, in public information evenings, we informed people told them a small bit about it, told them a bit about the challenge of Japanese knotweed, give them background information like I'm doing today. We developed a mobile app to allow communities to record it, find out where it is, and report all infestations. And this was followed on by a significant treatment programme by Mayor County Council. And it is the way forward. A targeted, dedicated, all multi-agency approach to a definite geographical area we find is the best solution, because you can say with 100% certainty that we mapped it all in the Greater Kilchimagh area in 2016, and we sprayed it in 2016, 2017, 2018. So, but it's all agency, and the huge challenge is education. And when people understand, we were sort of guaranteed their support. And the same thing happened in Westport. And I have to acknowledge the two organisations that support us in both. In the case of Kilchimagh, it was already Kilchimagh through Joe Kelly and his team and RSS, Rural Social Scheme over there. And in the case of Westport, it was the South West Mayo Development Company through Jerry O'Neill and his staff there. And the huge effort that they put in, and our own GIS section of Mayo County Council. So the way forward in treating Japanese knotweed is people like you, people within the community. We can only do a certain amount as a local authority or all agents of the state, but it's people. It's about getting community support, because, as I said, the difficulty is getting people, in a lot of our situations, is getting consent to go on private land to do it. So this all agency, multi-agency, massive, supported by the community, we believe is the way forward to treat them.